My dad refused to help a teenage girl who begged him for therapy, even as she knew our schedules, posted about him online, and stood outside my school every morning. When Mom finally screamed, "Who is she?" at Uncle Rob's funeral, he whispered something that made her shout, "17 years? That Portland conference? While I was pregnant?" I stayed silent. That was 18 months ago. Last week, he waited by his car, holding a photo album of every birthday he'd missed. In my dad's 30 years as a therapist, he's never refused to help someone. Killers, abusers, the worst people imaginable. Until this one seemingly innocent 16-year-old girl showed up. She had no violent tendencies or outbursts. She actually wanted to be in therapy, but Dad adamantly refused to help her. When we asked why, he mumbled something about her not being the right fit. We thought it was strange, but let it go. Until a week later when she started emailing him. "Please reconsider," she'd write. "I really need help." Dad deleted them without responding, but then she somehow got his personal cell number. Her texts began flooding in at all hours. I remember waking up at 3 a.m. to Dad's phone buzzing nonstop. 27 messages from an unknown number. Mom made him show her. They all said variations of the same thing. "Just one session, please." Mom cornered Dad at breakfast. "Why is she so desperate for you specifically?" Dad wouldn't look up from his coffee. "There are other therapists," he muttered. "She should find someone else." Mom pressed harder. "That's not an answer." Dad just grabbed his keys and left for work early. That's when she also started showing up at his office. The receptionist called the cops twice, but she'd always leave right before they arrived. Dad installed new locks and a security camera, thinking that would end it, but it didn't. She just switched tactics. She posted in every local Facebook group about how my dad, a supposed mental health advocate, had refused to help a teenager in crisis. The post went viral in our small town. People who'd known Dad for years started asking questions. She showed up at his professional conference and stood up during the Q&A. "Why won't you help me?" she asked into the microphone before security escorted her out. Dad just stood there, frozen. He looked terrified. She organized actual protests outside his office. She held a sign saying, "Mental health for all teens and no child left behind." That night, I asked Dad point blank, "Do you know her from somewhere?" His hand actually shook, pouring his drink. "No," he said too quickly. "Never seen her before she came to my office." I knew he was lying. Dad was never a good liar. Within a week, I was noticing her. She'd be standing across from my school every morning. Mom mentioned seeing that girl at her yoga class, always on the mat directly behind her, then at the grocery store, then at her book club meeting, sitting in the corner, pretending to read. We'd go out for family dinners and she'd somehow already be there, always 3 tables away, facing us. The waiter would mention someone had already paid for a drink to be sent to our table, but Dad would refuse it every time. She created fake social media accounts pretending to be our friends, posting embarrassing things about our family. Credit cards started arriving in Dad's name for accounts he never opened. Our bank called about suspicious activity. Someone had been trying to access his accounts from different IP addresses all over town. Mom finally exploded one evening. "She knows our routines, our schedules, everything. Who is she?" Dad kept insisting she was just a disturbed teenager who'd fixated on him. "It happens," he said. "Therapists deal with this." But his voice cracked. The girl's messages evolved into something darker. "Your wife drives alone to yoga every Thursday at 7. She texted Dad from a burner phone. I found a note in my locker. Your dad looks tired. You look just like him, BTW." Mom started getting photos of her car at different locations throughout the day, each one time-stamped, each one from a different angle. "The 39 bus doesn't have cameras," she messaged Dad right after I'd gotten on that exact bus. We changed our routines, installed cameras everywhere. Mom stopped going places alone. Dad hired security for his office. I started getting rides to school instead of walking. Our house felt like a prison. The truth finally came out at Uncle Rob's funeral. We were devastated. Rob had died suddenly in a car accident, and the whole family was shattered. Dad was giving the eulogy when I spotted her in the back row, wearing a black dress like she belonged there. She waited until Dad finished speaking, until we were all standing by the casket saying our final goodbyes. Then she walked straight up to us, not rushing, not sneaking, just walking with this eerie confidence. She stopped inches from Dad's face while we were all crying, grieving, vulnerable. "You need to talk to me," she said calmly. "I need you to talk to me." Dad went white. Mom grabbed his arm, confused and scared, but she was already looking at each of us. First Mom, then me. Her eyes weren't angry or crazy. They were desperate, like someone drowning in slow motion. Then she turned and walked out just as calmly as she'd arrived. That night, Dad finally broke. Mom was in the kitchen table. "Who is she?" I'd never seen Dad cry. Not once. Not when his father died. Not when he got sued. Never. But then tears started rolling down his face. He grabbed Mom's hand and whispered something I couldn't hear. She yanked away like she'd been burned. Upstairs. Now. 2 minutes of silence passed. That's when Mom's scream shook the walls. 17 years? That Portland conference? While I was pregnant? The gears started turning, and before I knew it, I found myself unblocking and texting her. My fingers were shaking as I typed, asking her to meet us at the diner on Oak Street, and she replied instantly saying she'd be there in 10 minutes. We piled into Dad's car in total silence and drove through empty streets while Mom stared out the window, and Dad gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. The diner was mostly empty at 2 a.m., except for a trucker in the corner booth and the night cook who barely looked up when we walked in. She was already there sitting in a back booth wearing the same black dress from the funeral, and when we slid in across from her, I finally saw it. Mom must have seen it too because she looked at Dad and said in this weird calm voice that she had his mother's eyes. The girl, Emma she told us her name was, actually flinched like she hadn't known that detail, and Dad just broke down sobbing into his hands while the cook pretended to wipe down the already clean counter. Emma reached into her bag and slid this official-looking document across the table, a legal petition for acknowledgement of paternity, and said she didn't want money just for him to admit she existed. Dad's hands shook so bad reading it that Mom had to take it from him, and that's when it hit me that she hadn't been stalking us for revenge, but just wanted to be recognized as his daughter. We stayed there until almost dawn went cold in our cups and nobody really talking, just sitting with this huge truth between us. Mom drove herself home while Dad took his car, and I rode with Emma in her beat-up Honda, and the whole ride I kept thinking about how I suddenly had a sister I never knew existed. When we got home, Mom went straight upstairs and locked the bedroom door while Dad grabbed a pillow and blanket for the couch, and Emma just stood in our living room looking lost. I showed her to the guest room and gave her some of Mom's old pajamas from the hall closet, and she looked so young and tired taking them that I almost forgot about all the stalking and harassment. 8 hours later, I woke up and went downstairs on autopilot to make breakfast like it was any normal Saturday morning. Emma appeared in the door doorway wearing those borrowed pajamas that were too big for her, and she looked even younger than 16 without all the makeup and determination from before. We sat at the kitchen table eating cereal in total silence, both too exhausted from the emotional marathon to even try making conversation. My phone started buzzing, and it was Dr. James Harwick, Dad's colleague, asking if everything was okay since Dad missed his morning appointments and wasn't answering his phone. I lied smoothly, saying Dad had food poisoning and would call him back later, but I knew the professional community would start noticing something was wrong soon. Mom came downstairs around noon, showered and dressed for work, even though it was Saturday, moving through the house like a ghost, not really seeing anything. She paused when she saw Emma at the breakfast table still in those pajamas, then continued to the coffee maker and announced to nobody in particular that she'd called in sick, and she never called in sick. Emma pulled out her phone and showed me she had recordings of every single attempt to contact Dad, every email, every voicemail, every time she'd shown up at his office, all documented with dates and times. She said her therapist told her she needed evidence of abandonment for her own healing process, and I realized she hadn't just been randomly stalking, but building an actual case with method to what seemed like madness. Dad came into the kitchen while Emma was in the shower and tried to explain to me about the affair, saying Mom had a difficult pregnancy, and he was scared and overwhelmed, and the conference was supposed to be an escape. I cut him off, asking if he escaped into another woman, and watched the man I'd idolized my whole life shrink even smaller in front of me. Later, I went to my room and started scrolling through 17 years of family photos on my phone, every Christmas morning, every birthday party, every vacation to the beach or mountains, and it all felt fake now. I kept wondering if Emma had any photos from those same years, if she celebrated her birthdays alone, or had Christmas mornings with just her mom while we had our perfect family traditions. The doorbell rang, and it was Sandra from Dad's office with a cardboard box of his things, saying James told her to bring them and that he was covering Dad's patients indefinitely. Dad took the box with shaking hands, realizing his professional reputation was already crumbling as news spread through our small town where everybody knew everybody's business. I'm trying to understand how Emma planned all this tracking and recording while being just 16. Did she figure out all those surveillance methods herself, or did someone teach her? 2 days later, a detective named Sarah Smith showed up at our door with a notebook asking about the stalking reports Dad had filed, and Dad sat there in our living room having to explain that he didn't want to press charges anymore because the girl was actually his daughter from before he married Mom. The detective kept writing in her notebook and looking at Dad like he was trash while Mom stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed watching the whole thing. After the detective left, Emma texted me asking if we could meet, and I found myself walking to the park where she was sitting on a bench with a shoebox full of old photos. She spread them out on the bench, showing me birthday parties with people I didn't recognize, and school plays where she said she always looked for someone in the audience who looked like her but never found them. She kept saying she always felt like a ghost, and now she knew why, which made my chest hurt even though I barely knew her. The next day, Mom cornered Emma outside the grocery store while Dad was at his lawyer's office, and I watched from the car as Mom got in Emma's face asking what she wanted and if it was money or just to destroy our family. Emma's answer shocked Mom because she said she just wanted to know me since I was the only innocent person in the whole mess, and Mom just stood there not knowing what to say. Later that week, I was going through Dad's home office looking for stamps when I found insurance statements showing he'd been seeing a therapist 3 towns over for years to deal with his guilt about Emma. The papers showed weekly appointments going back 5 years, and I actually threw up in the bathroom thinking about how he refused to help his own daughter while getting help for abandoning her. Emma started texting me more, and we decided to walk through town together, which turned into everyone staring at us because side by side you could see we had the same nose and eyes and the way we both walked with our hands in our pockets. People whispered and pointed, but Emma didn't seem to care, and I found myself feeling protective of her, even though I'd only known she existed for 3 days. Within a week, Dad's practice was falling apart as more clients found out about his 17-year lie and started pulling their files. Emma would sit in the coffee shop across from his office watching people leave with cardboard boxes, and I'd sometimes join her just sitting there watching our dad's life crumble. Mom moved into the guest room permanently, and at night I could hear her crying through the walls while Dad paced the hallway, and Emma would text me from her hotel asking if I was okay, and somehow we started forming this weird bond over watching our parents fall apart. Then Rachel Sinclair showed up, which was Emma's adoptive mom, and she stood in our driveway screaming at Emma to come home while all the neighbors watched from their windows. Rachel kept yelling about how they raised her and loved her, but Emma just said there was a difference between being raised and being paid to raise someone, which made Rachel's face go red. The next morning, I found a box Emma had brought with her, and inside were 17 years worth of Father's Day cards she'd made but never sent. The early ones had crayon drawings and said things like, "To my real daddy wherever you are," and they got more elaborate in middle school with poems, and then angry in high school with just black ink saying things like, "Thanks for nothing," until the last one from this year that just said, "I exist," in tiny letters. I brought them to Dad and watched his face go white before he ran to the bathroom and threw up while I just stood there holding this box of cards from a daughter he pretended didn't exist. 3 days later, Mom, Emma, and Rachel all ended up at the same coffee shop by accident, and they sat at different tables pretending not to see each other while everyone in the shop watched this weird triangle of pain. Mom left first, practically running out the door, then Rachel followed 5 minutes later, and Emma texted me that Mom looked sad, which was the first time she'd said anything about Mom that wasn't angry. That same afternoon, James showed up at our house with a six-pack and found Dad sitting alone in the dark living room staring at nothing. James set the beer down and sat across from Dad without turning on any lights. They sat there for maybe 10 minutes before James finally said he'd known about Emma since the Portland conference 17 years ago. Dad's head snapped up like he'd been slapped. James kept talking about how Dad had called him drunk from Portland, crying about what he'd done, begging for advice. James had told him to come clean right away, but Dad chose to hide it instead. Dad started shaking his head over and over like he could make the words stop being true. James stood up and walked to the door, then turned back and told Dad he'd chosen the coward's path and now everyone was paying for it. The next morning, Emma texted me asking if she could see Dad's office before it closed for good. I met her there even though Dad had already cleared most of it out. She walked around the empty space touching the walls where diplomas used to hang. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at the chair where hundreds of people had sat getting help while she'd been turned away. On his desk was one photo he hadn't packed yet, from the Portland conference 17 years ago. Emma picked it up and stared at it for a long time, then set it back down without saying anything. 3 days later, Mom's lawyer showed up at Dad's empty office with divorce papers. Dad was sitting on the floor surrounded by boxes when the guy walked in. He just took the papers and signed them right there without reading anything. Emma was watching from her car in the parking lot, and when I walked over, she rolled down her window. She said she never wanted this to happen. She just wanted a father. I stood there realizing everyone had lost what they wanted most in all of this mess. The next week, our local newspaper ran a front-page story about Dad being the town's beloved therapist with a secret daughter. They printed Emma's photo from when she was protesting outside his office right next to our family Christmas card from last year. The headline said, "The girl who wasn't there," and within hours it was all over Facebook and Twitter. People were sharing it with comments about how they never would have guessed, how Dad had helped their families while hiding his own secrets. Mom locked herself in her room for 2 days after that. Emma and I ended up at Uncle Rob's old fishing spot without planning it, both of us just needing to get away from everything. We sat on the dock where Rob used to take me when I was little. Emma had never met him, and it hit me that he would have been the one person who might have welcomed her without judgment. I told her Rob would have liked her because she had his stubborn streak. It was the first time I'd seen her actually smile since this whole thing started. 2 weeks passed before Dad finally moved out, getting a small apartment above the old hardware store downtown. I helped him carry boxes up the narrow stairs while Emma sat in her car across the street watching. When we finished, Dad stood at his new window and waved at her. Just a small wave, the first time he'd acknowledged her without being forced. She stared at him for a few seconds, then drove away without waving back. Mom started going to a support group for people whose spouses had affairs, and she came home from the first meeting looking lighter somehow. But then at dinner, she looked at me and said 17 years of lies kept hitting her at random moments. She said she kept doing the math, that I was inside her while Dad was with someone else. The raw pain in her voice made my chest hurt. The next day, I was having lunch with Emma at a diner when a process server walked up and handed her papers. Rachel, her adoptive mom, was threatening to sue my parents for emotional damages, claiming they'd corrupted her daughter. Emma read through the papers and actually laughed, but it was bitter and sharp. She said now they were fighting over who damaged her more, like she was some broken thing they both wanted to blame on each other. Later, Emma told me she'd been accepted to 3 different colleges, but deferred them all to find Dad. She pulled out the acceptance letters from her bag, all dated from months ago. She said she couldn't focus on her future without understanding her past first. I realized her whole stalking campaign had eaten up her entire senior year, all the normal stuff kids do before college just gone. That night at 3 in the morning, Emma's phone rang, and it was Dad leaving a voicemail. She played it for me the next day, and his voice was slurred and broken. He kept saying he was sorry, that she deserved better, that she deserved everything I got growing up. He called himself a coward and a failure, but said she was brave, braver than he'd ever be. Emma listened to it 3 times, then deleted it. But she'd saved a copy to her cloud first, and the next morning she picked me up and we sat in my car while she played it through her phone speaker. Dad's voice filled the small space and kept breaking as he said sorry over and over. She hit replay twice more before turning it off. I reached over and squeezed her hand for the first time since finding out we were siblings. 3 days passed before Mom ran into Emma at the grocery store near the cereal aisle. Mom stopped her cart and just stood there looking at her. She walked closer and touched Emma's shoulder. Mom told her she had our grandmother's eyes, but her determination was all her own. Emma started crying right there between the Cheerios and cornflakes, while Mom awkwardly patted her back. Other shoppers kept staring, but Mom didn't care. That same night, Dad swallowed a bottle of pills, then immediately called 911. What made Dad finally reach out with that voicemail after weeks of silence? His brain must have been working through so much guilt while drunk at 3 in the morning. The paramedics found him conscious on his bathroom floor, clutching his phone. They pumped his stomach at the hospital while Emma and I met for the first time as siblings in the waiting room. We didn't talk much, but we sat close enough that our shoulders touched. Mom arrived an hour later, and the 4 of us existed in the same space as a broken family. The doctor said Dad would need psychiatric evaluation before release. 3 days later, they moved him to a psychiatric facility for a 72-hour hold that got extended to 2 weeks. Emma insisted on being listed as family on the visitor forms, and the nurse didn't question it since the resemblance was obvious. While Dad was hospitalized, Emma and I went to his apartment to collect some clothes and books he wanted. We found her birth certificate in his office safe hidden under tax documents from 17 years ago. The paper was worn at the edges like he'd handled it often. Emma held it and stared at her tiny footprints. I told her he never forgot about her. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. Mom visited Dad at the facility the following Tuesday while Emma and I waited in the parking lot. We could see them through the big windows of the common room. Mom sat across from him at a small table and they talked for an hour without touching once. She didn't leave early though. Emma watched them and said Mom still loved him. I shook my head because love wasn't enough anymore. Detective Williams called me that week to say she was closing the stalking case officially. She'd written in her report that family reconciliation had begun. She told me in 20 years of police work she'd never seen anything like it. Emma just wanted to be seen and acknowledged. 2 days later, Rachel somehow got past security at the psychiatric facility and confronted Dad in the garden area. She was screaming at him about ruining Emma and how she'd been happy before finding out about him. Dad just sat there taking it without defending himself. Emma arrived just as Rachel yelled that she wished they'd never taken his money. Emma stepped between them and told Rachel to stop. She said Dad was weak and selfish, but he was still her father. Rachel couldn't attack him anymore. It was the first time Emma claimed him as family out loud. Rachel left crying and Emma sat with Dad in the garden until visiting hours ended. The next morning, I found Emma sleeping in her car outside our family home at dawn. She'd parked across the street with a clear view of the front door. When I knocked on her window, she startled awake and rolled it down. She admitted she used to do this before the stalking started. She'd watch the house wake up and imagine walking through that door and belonging there. I made her breakfast in Mom's kitchen while Mom was at her morning run, and we ate in silence until she asked if she could see Dad before leaving town. A month later, Dad got released from the psychiatric ward with a prescription for antidepressants and mandatory twice-weekly therapy sessions, and he moved into a small apartment downtown with 2 bedrooms, even though he lived alone. He started to tell me why he got the second bedroom but stopped mid-sentence and just stared at the empty room for a long time. Mom decided to keep our house but spent weeks tearing down every family photo from the walls, and I helped her paint their bedroom a bright yellow that Dad always said gave him headaches. Her hands shook holding the paintbrush, and she kept saying something about new beginnings, but her voice cracked every time. Emma called me crying because her college acceptance expired while she she was dealing with our family mess, and when she called the admissions office to explain they already knew about the viral news story, they offered her a gap year with guaranteed admission next fall, and the woman on the phone mentioned her essay about finding her father was prophetic, which made Emma laugh and cry at the same time. Dad's colleague James called with a research position at the university that meant no patient contact, and Dad almost refused until Emma convinced him to take it. She told him he couldn't help others until he helped himself, which was exactly what he used to tell his patients. 2 weeks after that, I brought Emma to my friend Tyler's birthday party and introduced her as my sister for the first time. People asked awkward questions about where she'd been and why they'd never met her, but she handled it perfectly. And later in my car, she said that was the best night of her life because someone introduced her as belonging to them. Mom and Emma met for coffee at a neutral cafe downtown, and Mom asked about her childhood and her adoptive parents and her dreams for the future. Mom said she couldn't be Emma's stepmother, but maybe they could be friends, and Emma nodded like she understood the boundaries, even though I saw her wipe her eyes when Mom wasn't looking. Dad started writing actual letters on paper to Emma and mailing them to me because he couldn't face giving them to her directly. The letters were long and detailed about his cowardice and shame, but also his pride in who she'd become despite him abandoning her. Then Rachel had a massive heart attack, and Emma got the call at 3 in the morning. I drove her to Portland going 90 the whole way, and met the people who raised my sister while machines kept Rachel alive. Rachel grabbed Emma's hand weakly and whispered an apology about taking the money, but said they loved her for free, and Emma forgave her right there in the ICU. After Rachel stabilized, we visited Uncle's grave together, and Emma placed flowers she'd bought at a gas station on the headstone, while I told her stories about his terrible dad jokes and how he always stood up for what was right. I told her Uncle would have fought for her and made Dad do the right thing if he'd known, and she cried into my shoulder for 20 minutes. The divorce papers got filed the next week with Dad offering Mom everything, including the house and all their savings and investments. His lawyer tried to talk him out of it, but Dad insisted 17 years of lies meant she deserved all of it, while Emma watched from the courthouse steps because she wasn't legally part of the family proceedings. 3 months passed with Emma living in this weird limbo where she existed in our town, but not really in our family. She took that gap year she'd been talking about and got a job at the little bookstore downtown on Main Street. The owner hired her even though everyone in town knew who she was by then. People would come in and whisper when they saw her shelving books or working the register. Some of them were nice enough to actually include her in small talk about the weather or whatever. I started visiting her there every single day during my lunch break from my summer job. We'd sit in the back room drinking bad coffee and just talking about normal stuff, movies we wanted to see, or stupid memes we'd found online. It was the first time we actually felt like real siblings instead of some weird experiment. Dad finally worked up the nerve to ask Emma to have dinner with him after weeks of me pushing him. Just the two of them at some Italian place 2 towns over where nobody would recognize them. Emma told me later how awkward it was at first with both of them just staring at their menus. Then she asked him to tell her about his mother, her grandmother who died before she was born. Dad actually started crying right there into his pasta, while telling stories about this woman Emma never got to meet. Mom found out she was pregnant the next week, which was insane since she was 45. She took 3 different tests before believing it, and I saw her smile for real for the first time since everything exploded. During the divorce mediation meeting, she had to tell Dad about the baby. He just said the kid would be lucky to have her all to itself without him messing things up. Emma heard about the pregnancy and immediately offered to leave town to make things easier for everyone. I completely lost it on her right there in her apartment. Told her she'd already spent 17 years in exile and wasn't running anymore. Said she was my sister and she was staying no matter what. She started crying and hugging me like I'd just saved her life or something. Dad went to court 2 weeks later to sign all the paternity papers making Emma officially his daughter. She decided to change her last name to Thompson Sinclair to honor both her mom's family and ours. Mom actually sent flowers to the courthouse with a card that said, "Welcome to the official mess." The DNA test Emma had ordered months earlier finally showed up at her apartment, even though we all knew what it would say. Seeing that 99.9% match made Dad break down completely. He kept saying he'd wasted 17 years denying basic math while staring at the paper. Emma finally confronted him about all those child support payments her mom had mentioned. Asked if he thought money would make her disappear from his life. Dad admitted he'd thought paying enough would give her a good life without him having to be there. Told her money doesn't replace actually being present for someone, and she didn't forgive him yet. I helped Emma move into a small apartment downtown the next week. While we were unpacking, she showed me this shoebox full of Father's Day cards she'd bought over the years. Said she'd stand in the card aisle every June crying because she wanted to send them but didn't know where. We just sat there on her floor surrounded by moving boxes and mourning all that lost time. Mom went into labor at only 28 weeks, which was terrifying. I called Emma without even thinking about it, and she met us at the hospital. Dad showed up last, and the 4 of us sat in that waiting room together. Mom looked at all of us and said this baby would have all of us no matter what happened with the divorce. The shoebox full of Father's Day cards makes me wonder how many other secret rituals Emma created to cope with not knowing her dad. Did she celebrate his birthday alone too? Those cards represent years of one-sided love just waiting to be delivered. She was including Emma in that us for the first time ever. The baby came out tiny but stable, and Mom named her Grace. When the nurse was filling out paperwork and asked about siblings, Mom said she has a brother and sister. Emma got to hold Grace through those little holes in the NICU incubator. She whispered that she'd be the sister she never got to have while tears ran down her face. 6 months passed before Dad finally moved back to town, getting a small rental house just 3 blocks from where Mom still lived with Grace. The divorce papers had been signed 2 months earlier, but he wanted to stay close enough to see Grace regularly. Emma showed up at his new place with a box of kitchen stuff she'd bought at Target, and I watched from the doorway as they unpacked dishes together without really talking. She'd hand him plates and he'd put them in cabinets, both of them moving around each other like they were learning some weird dance. Mom had gone back to work part-time and started asking Emma to watch Grace while she was at the office. I'd come home from school and find Emma on the living room floor with Grace on a blanket, making faces at her and letting her grab her fingers. Mom walked in once while Emma was changing Grace's diaper like she'd been doing it forever, and said Emma was good at this. Emma just kept focusing on Grace and mentioned she'd practiced on dolls for 17 years pretending they were siblings. That same week, I started working on my college application essays, sitting at the kitchen table trying to figure out how to explain our family situation. I wrote about discovering I had a sister and losing the dad I thought I knew all in the same year. Emma read it over my shoulder one afternoon and grabbed grabbed my pen to add a line about gaining a truth that set us all free. I kept her addition even though the guidance counselor said it might be too dramatic. Rachel showed up at our door with legal papers claiming Dad had damaged Emma psychologically with his hush money payments, and she was suing for emotional damages and fraud. The court date got set for 3 weeks later, and Emma had to testify. She sat in that witness chair looking straight at Rachel and told the judge the only damage was the lies from everyone, and at least Dad paid for his guilt. The judge dismissed the case that same day. Dad started commuting 2 hours each way to practice therapy in a different city where nobody knew our story. He told Emma during one of their awkward coffee meetings that his first new patient was a man who'd abandoned his kid 20 years ago. Dad had stopped the session halfway through and told the guy he couldn't help him, then referred him to someone else. Some wounds just cut too deep to treat when you've lived them yourself. Emma came up with this idea for Sunday dinners where we'd all eat together despite the divorce. Every Sunday at 5, we'd gather at Mom's house with Dad bringing takeout and all of us sitting around the table with Grace in her high chair. Nobody talked much, but we showed up every week because Grace deserved to grow up seeing her whole family even if we were broken. The dinners were painful with long silences and Mom barely looking at Dad, but Emma kept organizing them and we kept showing up. A documentary filmmaker called Mom's cell one Tuesday, saying she'd heard about our story and wanted to film us for a series about family secrets. Mom hung up immediately, but the woman called Emma next, and Emma actually considered it. She brought it up at Sunday dinner saying our story could help other families and that secrets destroy people, but transparency might save some. Mom shook her head hard, but Dad stayed quiet, and I could tell he was thinking about it too. The filmmaker kept calling for weeks until Mom threatened legal action. Dad joined a support group for parents who'd abandoned their children, driving 40 minutes to meetings every Thursday night. He told Emma once that he was the only person in the group whose kid had stalked them to force acknowledgement. He'd told the group Emma was braver than all of them because she refused to just disappear like abandoned kids were supposed to. Emma got her acceptance letter to therapy school on a rainy March afternoon and called Dad right away. He offered to pay her tuition, but she turned him down flat, saying she'd take out loans because she wanted to earn it without his guilt money. I saw him later that week at the bank setting up a college fund for Grace instead, putting away the money Emma wouldn't take. Through all of this, I became the translator between everyone, explaining Mom's hurt to Emma when she didn't understand why Mom was so cold, telling Dad what Emma needed when she couldn't say it herself, helping Mom see that Emma was a victim too. At 17, I was scheduling the Sunday dinners, mediating the arguments, and basically holding our weird broken family together because somebody had to, and I was the only one everybody still talked to. 9 months of Sunday dinners and awkward holidays passed before everything changed again when Emma called me at 2 in the morning, sobbing so hard I couldn't understand her at first. Rachel had another heart attack while making breakfast and died before the ambulance even got there. Emma kept saying she was alone now, really alone, and I didn't know what to say except that I'd pick her up. The funeral was 3 days later at this small church in Portland where Rachel had gone since Emma was little. Dad showed up even though nobody invited him, sitting in the very last pew wearing his only black suit. Emma saw him when she turned around after placing a rose on the casket and just nodded once before looking away. After everyone left for the reception, Emma and I stayed to go through Rachel's apartment since she didn't want to do it alone. We found boxes of photos of Emma growing up, report cards Rachel had saved, every art project Emma ever made. Then Emma opened Rachel's desk drawer and froze, pulling out a stack of letters tied with ribbon, all addressed to Dad but never sent. She read them out loud, her voice breaking on lines about how Emma deserved to know her father, how brilliant and kind she was, how Rachel had tried to hate him but couldn't. Emma dropped the letters and ran to the bathroom where I heard her throwing up, then crying harder than at the funeral. The lawyer called the next week saying Rachel left everything to Emma, including the house they'd lived in before Rachel got sick. Emma decided to sell it immediately, telling me she'd use the money for therapy school to help other kids like her. Meanwhile, Mom was dealing with Grace getting bigger and starting to look more like Dad every day. During one custody exchange, Mom held Grace while Emma and I looked through old family photos on my phone. Mom watched us and told Dad they looked like siblings with the same smile, and Dad actually agreed it was his mother's smile. 2 months later, I got my acceptance letter to State University across the country, and Emma completely lost it. She grabbed my shoulders saying I couldn't leave right when she'd found me, but we both knew I had to go. Mom watched from the doorway as Emma and I held each other in the kitchen, both crying now. That's when Dad finally asked Emma if she'd do family therapy with him, not as therapist and patient, but with someone neutral. Emma agreed, but laid out her terms right there in our living room, saying they'd address all 17 years with no excuses. The first session was brutal when Emma told them about trying to kill herself at 14, not understanding why she felt so empty inside. Dad started hyperventilating so bad the therapist had to stop the session and get him a paper bag. The next week, Mom showed up uninvited with Grace, walking right into the therapy room saying Grace needed to know her whole family. Watching Dad hold Grace while sitting next to Emma made Mom say this was what honesty looked like. Messy, but real. During the 4th session, Emma finally asked the question she'd been holding back, asking Dad if he would have ever acknowledged her without the stalking. His silence was the answer, and Emma nodded, saying she'd made him see her, refused to be his ghost. My graduation came faster than expected, and the whole weird family showed up, Emma sitting with Mom and Grace while Dad stood alone in the back. When I thanked my sister Emma in my speech, the whole auditorium turned to stare at her, but I didn't care because truth mattered more than comfort. After the ceremony, Dad waited by his car holding a thick photo album, his hands shaking as Emma walked over. He opened it to show 17 years of school photos he'd secretly collected from yearbook websites and public records. Each page had her birthdays marked with notes about what she might have liked that year, based on what other kids her age wanted. Emma flipped through pages, seeing herself at 5, 7, 12, all the ages he'd missed, with his handwriting describing imaginary birthday parties he'd planned in his head. She closed the album and nodded, understanding that broken love was still love. Mom announced the next week she was selling our house because there were too many ghosts in every room. Emma came to help pack and found a box Dad had hidden in the attic with her hospital bracelet, a tiny pink ribbon, and her newborn footprints on paper. Dad walked in while she was holding them and just said he'd kept her the only way he knew how. The house sold 3 weeks later on what would have been their 20th anniversary. Mom and Dad signed papers at different times, but Emma brought Grace to both, telling the realtor that endings needed witnesses too. I left for college in August with Emma driving me to the airport in Dad's old car he'd given her. At the departure gate, I told her that her refusing to disappear had freed us all from 17 years of lies. She cried then, the first real tears I'd seen since she'd shown up at our door. Rachel kept letters about Emma deserving to know her father but never sent them. That makes me wonder if Rachel struggled with the same guilt Dad felt all those years. 2 weeks later, she started therapy school, living in a small apartment above a used bookstore downtown. Dad sent her a card saying her grandmother would be proud, the first time he'd ever given her that family connection. Mom moved into a smaller house with Grace, starting fresh traditions without the weight of old secrets hanging over dinner conversations. Emma came for Sunday dinners, and they slowly built something that wasn't quite stepmother and stepdaughter, but two women who'd survived the same man differently. Dad kept going to therapy and taking his medication, accepting he'd never fully heal from what he'd done to everyone. He started volunteering at a crisis center on weekends, telling his story to men who were thinking about walking away from their kids. Marcus called from college for Grace's first birthday, and we all gathered around Mom's laptop screen looking like some modern version of family. Grace reached for Emma during the call and said Mama by accident, but nobody corrected her because maybe it wasn't wrong. Emma got her first semester grades back with straight A's and texted our weird family group chat that now included Dad. Dad texted back that she'd always been purpose, but he'd been too scared to see it clearly. Now Emma sits in her apartment working on her thesis about kids who forced their biological parents to acknowledge them after years of denial. She titled it something about refusing to be erased, and how stalking can sometimes be love wearing a desperate mask. From her window, she can see Dad walking Grace in her stroller, while Mom jogs beside them on the sidewalk, not together, but moving in the same direction. I video called her yesterday from my dorm, and she told me about her thesis project and how she's interviewing other abandoned kids who fought for recognition. We're all still here, she said before hanging up, just arranged differently than we started. She went back to typing, finally writing her own story instead of haunting someone else's life. Really enjoyed just hanging out and wondering about stuff with you today. It was a good time. We'll do it again soon. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.